On the morning of February 3rd, the British Crown executed a maneuver that hadn't been seen in living memory. They froze two passports. These didn't belong to international fugitives, and they didn't belong to criminals evading the law. They belonged to two children born into one of the most scrutinized families on the planet. The order didn't come with a press release. There were no cameras, no royal rota statements, and absolutely no warning. Inside the palace systems, it looked like a simple procedural lock, a technical glitch to the untrained eye. But in constitutional terms, it was a nuclear option. It signaled that the monarchy had determined the safety, identity, and continuity of Prince Harry's children were in immediate danger. And in the eyes of the Crown, once that determination is made, there is no going back. For Harry, this move came at a time when he thought the worst was over. He believed a custody agreement was signed, the lawyers had retreated, and a fragile peace was in place. He was wrong. Peace was just an illusion covering up a much darker reality. What triggered this wasn't a public interview or a new book. It was silence, a terrifying specific pattern of withdrawals that left no paper trail. By the time the Crown made its move, they weren't reacting to a single bad decision. They were responding to a trajectory that pointed toward one chilling outcome: total erasure. And what they found in a sealed legal notification just days prior changed everything. Inside Windsor, the panic didn't start with a shout. It started with a whisper. Senior advisors began noticing that educational links were being severed without notice. Medical appointments were quietly canceled. Communication channels that were supposed to be open for safeguarding were suddenly blocked. It wasn't just that things were changing. It was how carefully those changes were being hidden. Taken individually, you could explain them away as a scheduling conflict or a change of heart. But when you put them all together on a timeline, they formed a pattern that palace intelligence described as preparation. By the time Prince William was briefed, the language had shifted from custody dispute to identity risk. The decision to freeze those passports wasn't punishment. It was a rescue mission. Under ancient royal guardianship principles, if a child is at risk of being removed from their historical context, intervention isn't optional. It's mandatory. But here is the part that no one saw coming. Almost immediately after the freeze, Prince Harry began making accusations that stunned even the most seasoned officials, claims that didn't just implicate the usual suspects, but pointed to a crisis that had been unfolding for months behind his back. But to understand why the Crown went nuclear, we have to go back to the first alarm. It didn't ring in London. It rang in Santa Barbara. On January 31st, administrators at two exclusive private schools noticed a breach of protocol that was impossible to ignore. Archie and Lilibet didn't show up for the new term. Now children miss school all the time. Families travel, schedules slip. But by midday, the mood in the administrative offices had shifted from annoyance to genuine concern. There had been no notice of withdrawal, no transfer request papers, no polite email from a parent or a legal representative, nothing. Even more disturbing, the schools hadn't been informed of a replacement institution. Usually, when you pull a child out of a high-end school, you have to list where they are going. It's a safeguarding requirement. Here, the destination line was blank. Staff attempted to contact Meghan Markle directly. Emails went into the void. Calls rang out. Messages left with her administrative team produced absolute silence. When the schools reached out to the court-appointed mediator, the person literally paid to oversee the children's welfare, they found that office was just as in the dark. That is the moment this crossed the threshold. When children vanish from the educational system without explanation and the guardian is unreachable, it stops being a private family matter and becomes a missing persons risk. By that evening, alerts were hitting international child welfare monitors, including the UK liaison team. And what they dug up next turned that concern into cold, hard fear. There were no travel notifications, no residency changes. But when investigators checked the pediatric records, the pattern repeated itself. Multiple routine medical appointments had been canceled in rapid succession. Not rescheduled, canceled. No follow-up instructions, no new doctor listed. To experienced child welfare professionals, this combination, school withdrawal plus medical interruption plus parental silence, is a red flashing light. It usually means one of two things: flight or concealment. By February 2nd, the internal communications at the palace had hardened. Words like oversight were gone, replaced by obstruction. The The question wasn't where the children were anymore. It was why every system designed to keep them visible was being deliberately cut. A palace source later summarized the mood in the corridors of Windsor with chilling simplicity. This was not negligence. This was preparation. The Crown realized they were watching the early stages of an intentional void being created around two royal children. And once that possibility exists, royal protocol leaves no room for delay. The next step wouldn't involve a conversation. It would involve a folder that would change the course of history for the Sussex family. The emergency meeting wasn't scheduled on any official calendar. There was no briefing memo circulated to the press. Senior aides were told to clear a room at Windsor Castle in minutes. Phones were confiscated. Assistants were dismissed. This wasn't a discussion. It was a presentation of facts. Princess Anne entered the room carrying a thick red folder. Those present described the atmosphere as instantly sobering. This folder was marked with language rarely used outside of constitutional crises: immediate custodial breach. She placed it on the table in front of the king and didn't even sit down. The message was delivered plainly. The family had endured years of drama interviews and public attacks, but what had been uncovered now crossed a line that couldn't be managed with never complain, never explain. This was about two children being left in legal and emotional limbo. The folder contained documents compiled by multiple intelligence departments working in isolation. The first section detailed the school withdrawals we just discussed, but it also contained written instructions from Meghan's legal team explicitly blocking further communication with royal education liaisons. That is a hostile act. It's a wall being built. The second section addressed the medical care, confirming that the children currently had no registered doctor and no continuity plan. In safeguarding terms, that is a serious dereliction of duty. But it was the financial documentation that made the blood run cold in that room. A long-established education trust fund valued at over £6 million and created specifically to secure the children's future schooling had been dissolved. The paperwork was finalized. The funds had been redirected. There was no indication that money was being moved to a new school. It was just gone. For the seasoned advisors, this raised the ultimate question: why dismantle a child's educational future while simultaneously pulling them out of school? The answer was waiting in the final document of the folder. This was an intelligence memo dated January 29th, prepared by the Royal Intelligence Advisory Group. It was marked privileged and confidential. Unlike the other papers, this didn't just list actions. It outlined intent. According to the assessment, Meghan Markle had spent the previous 4 months preparing for what analysts described as complete maternal disengagement. The memo cited contracts and strategic planning documents that had been intercepted or reviewed. Among them was a non-disclosure agreement with a Dubai-based media financier. This agreement requested the removal of all past family associations ahead of a planned solo brand launch. The language was specific personal reinvention and narrative separation, but it went deeper. There were internal contracts linked to Archewell operations instructing that all references to Archie and Lilibet be removed from future Spotify and Netflix materials by mid-2026. Their names, their images, their presence. To the people in that room, the implication was unmistakable. This wasn't a mother asking for privacy. This was a systematic effort to erase the children from public and institutional identity while she retained full personal autonomy. One legal advisor at the table summarized it with brutal precision. This is not co-parenting. This is erasure. Princess Anne didn't ask for votes. She didn't invite debate. She authorized immediate escalation. Duchess Sophie was instructed to activate emergency custodial safeguard procedures on the spot. A formal case was opened for submission to both the Royal Chancery Court and the California Family Court. When Prince William arrived, he was handed the same red folder. Witnesses say he read it in silence page after page without a single visible reaction. But when he reached that final intelligence memo, he looked up and spoke only once. This is no longer about her. It is about protecting two children emotionally, legally, and historically. That statement became the doctrine. From that second on, the Crown wasn't reacting to events. They were taking command of them. The intelligence mapped a sequence that was impossible to deny. First, the quiet reduction of public references. Then, the contractual restructuring for a solo career. Then the refusal to commit to co-parenting structures and emails to Harry, and finally the physical removal of the children from school and medical care. The timing was the smoking gun. These preparations for a solo brand coincided exactly with the dismantling of the children's daily structure. One palace official described the realization as a moment of collective clarity. They weren't watching a custody dispute. They were witnessing the early stages of abandonment carried out with the precision of a corporate merger. The phrase intent became the most dangerous word in the palace. Accidents happen. Oversights can be fixed. But deliberate disengagement paired with strategic planning demands intervention. Princess Anne authorized the use of the emergency custodial safeguard. This mechanism exists for one purpose: to intervene when a royal child's continuity is at risk due to the actions of a guardian. It wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as containment. Within hours, the Royal Chancery Court and the California Family Court were notified. Parallel jurisdiction was established to ensure no loopholes could be exploited. Time was the enemy. But where was Prince Harry in all of this? Sources indicate he was kept outside the room until the framework was set. His position, while emotionally significant, was legally secondary. Advisors noted his unresolved residency issues, his financial instability, and his lack of independent infrastructure. The Crown made a stark calculation. 2 children could not be left suspended between a mother who was disengaging and a father who had no stable ground to stand on. They needed certainty. And when Prince William reviewed the memo, the discussion narrowed to one question: how far are we willing to go? The answer was all the way. If the Crown failed to act now, it would be complicit in their erasure. That assessment removed all hesitation. Legal mechanisms that had been dormant for decades were dusted off. Emergency clauses drafted during the abdication crisis of Edward VIII were brought back into circulation. The Crown was preparing to do something it hates doing: assume direct responsibility. Prince William returned to Windsor for an emergency session of the Royal Advisory Council. This wasn't a chat, it was a decision forum. The evidence was reviewed one last time: educational withdrawal, medical interruption, financial dismantling, strategic erasure, a parent unreachable, a secondary guardian unstable. The council reached a unanimous agreement. The threshold had been crossed. At that moment, Prince William invoked Appendix 4 of the Royal Succession Stabilization Act. This clause permits the Crown to assume guardianship when royal minors face identity displacement or legal abandonment. It carries extraordinary weight. Immediately, protective measures were enacted. The passports were locked down. This prevented any international movement without dual authorization from Princess Anne herself. Simultaneously, an image protection order was issued under the Windsor Privacy Act for a period of 5 years. This is huge. It prohibited any commercial or promotional use of the children's names, likenesses, or narratives without explicit Crown approval. Netflix, Spotify publishers, they were all put on notice. The children were no longer content commodities. Then came the financial response. Prince William authorized the Royal Restoration Fund, £12 million dedicated not to PR but to recovery. This money was ring-fenced for therapy specializing in cross-cultural identity trauma and for rebuilding their education. This was the Crown putting its money where its mouth was. As these measures clamped down, Prince Harry finally tried to make a move. He submitted a request for temporary custodial authority. According to sources, it was reviewed and declined within hours. The reasoning was cold and procedural. You don't have a residence. You don't have the independent resources. You don't meet the safeguarding standards. The letter he received contained no apology. It simply stated that protection of the children now fell solely under Crown protocol. For Harry, this was the moment the ground fell out from under him. He realized he wasn't the decision-maker anymore. He was just an observer. The operation was complete by nightfall. Systems locked, orders filed, no leaks. The absence of spectacle was the point. One senior advisor said, "The Crown did not take the children away. It stepped in because no one else could be trusted to hold the line." But while Windsor moved with discipline, the silence from the other side was deafening. Meghan Markle did not respond. Requests for clarifications sent through legal channels were acknowledged and then ignored. Statements were drafted and then withheld. What emerged was a deliberate, absolute silence. As the legal orders took effect, the consequences rippled out. Streaming platforms quietly scrubbed references to the children. Financial regulators froze accounts linked to Meghan's holding structures not to punish but to protect assets that might belong to the minors. Sponsorship deals tied to family storytelling collapsed because suddenly there was no family story to sell. Then the reports surfaced. Meghan was placed aboard a luxury yacht in Doha, photographed with a Middle Eastern media investor. To the public, it looked like freedom. To the Crown, it confirmed the intelligence. There were no inquiries about the children's location, no formal objections filed, no frantic flight home, just distance. Inside the palace, the responsibility for the children's emotional welfare was quietly reassigned. Princess Catherine stepped into the role. There were no press releases about this. She simply adjusted her schedule. Specialists were brought in. Stability was restored through routine, not cameras. But there was one small moment that said everything. A single photograph was released to the press without a caption. It showed Lilibet walking out of Windsor Chapel holding Princess Charlotte's hand. No commentary was needed. To the public, it was a sweet image. To those who knew the truth, it was a message. The children are no longer adrift. They are anchored. Eventually, Meghan's legal team issued a brief statement citing privacy concerns. It contained no reference to the children's well-being. It offered no reassurance. Within Windsor, the reaction was subdued but resolute. Silence, when paired with action, speaks louder than any interview. The Crown had closed the circle. The passports remain frozen. The funds remain locked. And for the first time in years, the children are safe not because of their parents, but in spite of them. And as for Harry, he sits in a unique kind of purgatory, realizing that in his bid for freedom, he lost the one thing he swore to protect. The question now isn't if the children will return to California. The question is, with the Crown now holding the legal guardianship, will they ever be allowed to leave? But to truly understand the scale of this intervention, you have to look beyond just the passports. The passport freeze was just the lock on the door. The financial freeze was the shutting off of the lights. Remember that image protection order issued under the Windsor Privacy Act. Most people missed the fine print on that. It wasn't just a request for privacy. It was a commercial embargo. For 5 years, any unauthorized use of the children's names or likenesses is prohibited. Think about what that does to the business model in Montecito. According to the intelligence brief to the Crown sponsorship negotiations linked to family-oriented storytelling, didn't just stall, they collapsed overnight. Why? Because you cannot sell a story you no longer own. The Crown didn't just take custody of the children, they took custody of their narrative. The holding structures linked to Meghan's media ventures were frozen by regulators not as a punishment, but as a precautionary measure to prevent the misuse of minors' assets. This brings us to the most jarring contrast of this entire saga. While these financial iron gates were slamming shut in London, and while Prince Harry was receiving letters denying him custodial authority, the intelligence reports placed Meghan Markle in a very different setting. As we mentioned, she was photographed aboard a luxury yacht in Doha. But the context here is devastating. While emergency legal teams were working around the clock in Windsor to stabilize the children's education and therapy, the primary parent of record was effectively off the grid. There were no frantic flights back to the UK. There were no public pleas for the return of her children. To the advisors monitoring the situation, that silence was the final confirmation of the maternal disengagement theory. It wasn't that she couldn't get back. It appeared she had already moved on. For Prince Harry, this reality has been a slow-motion car crash. He's now realizing that the parallel parenting he hoped for is impossible when one side holds all the cards. The Crown has proven that they don't need to shout to be heard. They just need to enforce the rules that were written long before Harry or Meghan were even born. The Royal Restoration Fund is now active. The therapists are in place. The passports are in a safe in the deepest recesses of the palace. The Crown has drawn a line in the sand that says, you can leave the institution, but you cannot take the legacy with you. And for Archie and Lilibet, for the first time in their lives, the chaos has stopped. The silence isn't empty anymore. It's safe. Whatever happens next, one thing is clear. The fragile peace is over. The Crown has stopped negotiating. And silence Silence is no longer an option.